Now is a dear friend, Jared Cohen. He's joining us on Open Book. He's a New York Times best-selling author. He's president of global affairs and co-head of applied innovation at Goldman Sachs. He's a former CEO of Jigsaw. And you've written a lot of different books, by the way. You are a polymath. I'm sure your mother's very proud of you, Jared, okay, as she should be. But this book is fascinating, and I think it's well-timed. Life After Power, 7 Presidents and Their Search for Purpose Beyond the White House. I'm a huge fan of your books. I want to talk about a couple of them, if you don't mind. But before we do that, let's start with an open-ended question. What happens after stepping down from being leader of the free world?
Look, it's the most dramatic retirement in the world, right? You're literally the most powerful person in the world, and you're either fired by, millions of people and you go back to being a civilian, or you get termed out and you go back to being a civilian anyway. And you look at these presidents, they're these seemingly unrelatable people, right? They're only dealing with matters of, world hunger and world peace and these kind of big macro level issues. And then they wake up the next day and they all of a sudden have asymmetry of information. They watch their successors, whether they like them or not, slowly dismantle their legacy. They're left with the relationships that are often kind of broken and fragile and need to be repaired. Their whole pace of life changes. There's nothing quite like it. And all of a sudden, these presidents become figures that, much to my surprise, you can start to relate to, right? I mean, we all ask this question many times in our lives of what's next. And, it's not just about the last chapter of life. We're going to ask it several times throughout the course of our time on this earth. And we don't think to look at presidents of the United States, but the more dramatic the transition, the harder the transition is. And the harder the transition is, I think, the more prescriptive it is. And so, my last book looked at when presidents die in office. This one looks at what happens when they live. And I look at 7 different presidents. Each got after it in a very different way, and each represents a different model for how to answer the question, what's next?
Okay, so it's a good segue, because we're dying to know on Open Book why you chose those 7. What was the criteria that went off in your mind? Obviously, list the 7 for our viewers, if you don't mind. And then did you consider including any others?
So it's an interesting question. Which presidents do you include, right? And I was looking for presidents that I felt found a greater sense of purpose after they left the White House. And what I was surprised by is the story of post-presidencies is not a particularly happy one. They range from presidents developing alcohol addictions to suffering from severe depression, many meandering and not knowing what to do. Alexander Hamilton, by the way, famously asked the question in Federalist 72, is it a good idea for the stability of the republic and the well-being of our country to have half a dozen men who served as president wandering around the rest of us like disenchanted ghosts? And frankly, many of the ex-presidents wandered around like disenchanted ghosts. The 7 that I chose were frankly the only 7 that I thought were really worth covering, all for different reasons. And so I look at Thomas Jefferson, who was a lifelong founder, 3 things etched on his tombstone, none of which was being president. His last act was the founding of University of Virginia. It was the 3rd volume in his life trilogy. The other is obviously the Declaration of Independence and Virginia Statute of Religious Freedom. I look at John Quincy Adams, who is a man whose presidency was an intermission between 2 of the greatest acts in history, one architected for him by his parents that made him president, the other that he sort of stumbled in as an ex-president serving 9 terms in the House of Representatives, where in a much lower station, he found a much higher calling of abolition. I look at Grover Cleveland, who's the man who made a comeback. He's the only president in history who's successfully run for office again and won. I look at William Howard Taft, who represents, a story that I think is familiar to many people, which is you have some dream, something that you want to do, and you have to defer it because the timing isn't right, the circumstances aren't right. And all he ever wanted to be was Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. But his wife, his mentor, Theodore Roosevelt, and his brothers wanted him to be president. And it's only in his last 10 years of life that he becomes Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. I look at Herbert Hoover, who represents a story of recovery. The man lived 90 years. He's defined by 3.5, of the Great Depression while he was president. he was known as the great humanitarian and a great businessman, self-made millionaire before the presidency. And he spent his 32 years in the post-presidency not just trying to recapture his good name, but more importantly, recapturing his ability to serve the world as a great humanitarian and leader. I look at Jimmy Carter, who wanted to turn the presidency into a lifelong appointment. And he was the first one to take the idea of being a former version of yourself and build real infrastructure around it and use it as a platform. And his 42 plus years as a post-president is the longest in history. And then when I looked at the active living presidents, right, because Carter's obviously gone into hospice since last February. So when I look at the active living presidents, there's only one whose popularity has doubled. So George W. Bush's popularity is north of 60%, and yet he's done less to invest in his legacy than anyone else. And so I wanted to understand why. And it's a combination of his just dogmatic, disciplined reverence for Washington's principle of one president at a time. The fact that that's aged well in the era of Trump when you sort of juxtapose the two against each other, and the fact that he's managed to find a post-presidential voice that allows him to advocate for issues that he cares about through painting in ways that doesn't undermine his successors. And he's had a popularity renaissance. And whether you like him or not, it's hard to argue with that. And you compare that with, other active living presidents who dogmatically and obsessively focus on trying to build their legacy, they would die for George W. Bush's numbers.
Well, I mean, there's so much there, and that's why I'm letting you talk, because you're brilliant and you're erudite, and I learned so much from you. Accidental presidents, I learned so much because that's a weird circumstance as well. You're sitting there as the vice president one moment, and John Gardner, I think it wasn't worth more than a bucket of, and we cleansed it up and called it spit. And then boom, you're the leader of the free world. And those stories were very intriguing. This is different. Reagan said in his book, The American Life, he said that, wow, I got endless number of phone calls and messages. The day I left Washington, I was down to, I think the dry cleaner said I had to go pick up something in Santa Barbara. Bush, in the last couple of pages of his book, he writes about taking his dog out for a walk. And of course, you have to curb your dog in the residential area he's living in Houston. And so he's down on his knees with a plastic baggie on his hand, cleaning the dog poo from his dog. And he's just letting people know that he went from being the American president, leader of the free world, and now he's on his knees taking care of his leader, which happens to be his dog. And so you know the story there. I guess what I would say to you that is always fascinating to me about these people is, how do they see themselves? I know how you see them. I know how I see them. But when you do the homework on these people, how do they see themselves, Jared?
So, Anthony, this is one of my favorite parts about writing presidential history, is you get to try to really get in the head of these, great leaders who've been deceased for a long period of time. It's almost like, what you hear about actors doing, right? So Daniel Day-Lewis, before he plays Lincoln, he, spends multiple years like getting in the brain of Abraham Lincoln. And that's one of, I find, the most interesting, and it can also be kind of a torturing experience writing these books. But look, I think it varies. These are 7 very different men that I wrote about. And, to sort of begin where we left off, George W. Bush is unique to any other president in the sense that he has this ability to live life as a chapter guy. Right. So when one chapter is done, he just completely detaches and moves on. He's not at all introspective. He, feels like you can't long for what you can't have. He tells me when it's over, and he doesn't miss it. And frankly, I believe him. That bothers people who are critical of him, but that's who he is. But then you look at somebody like Thomas Jefferson, and Thomas Jefferson, this is a man who just personality wise, he was what we would today describe as a serial entrepreneur or a serial founder. And at a very, very young age, he was a co-founder of the United States. And he was well aware that he had built a sort of republic business that, had many, many flaws that they couldn't get around to patching up or weren't right to patch up. And he had deep, deep anxiety as one of the last living founding fathers that if they didn't train the next generation to improve the product wouldn't last. And so after writing the Declaration of Independence and the Virginia Statute on Religious Freedom, he wanted to finish the third volume of his life trilogy and found the university, the first arts and sciences university in the country to do this, which became known as the University of Virginia. The problem is, like any founder, he got saddled with obligations, right? They needed him to be vice president. They needed him to be secretary of state. They needed him to be president twice. And he lost very valuable years. Those were not things that he wanted to do. He wanted to get on to found the next thing. And the poor guy at 82 years old, Anthony, this is my favorite story in the book. At 82 years old, a frail Thomas Jefferson opens the doors of the University of Virginia, and within months, students cover their faces in masks in kind of like an 1825 example of social media anonymity, and they start rioting through the campus that he personally designed and architected, chanting, "Down with European professors." And they take bags of urine and throw it at the professors. They beat another professor with the cane. And in sort of a twisted show of Southern honor, none of them will give each other up. So Jefferson, who's the rector of the university, calls an all-school assembly the next day for all the students to meet before the disciplinary committee. And the disciplinary committee for the University of Virginia in 1825 was Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and James Monroe, the most intimidating disciplinary committee, past, present, and future. And so Jefferson stands up to address the students, and he starts bawling, hysterically crying. And so these students, they're so awestruck by this man that they revere, just being inconsolable. And at James Madison, all of 5'1", tells Jefferson to sit down, and he can't get a word out of his mouth before the students one by one confess. And this is the kind of man that Thomas Jefferson was. And each one of these presidents, I think part of why they found a greater sense of purpose after the White House is they figured out how to align who they were with what they did next. And the consistent thread, there's not a lot of consistent threads across all of them because they each did it in different ways. But the consistent thread is each one of them doubled down on something that they were dogmatically principled about.
Listen, it's fascinating. Jefferson, quite the life, got into a big political rub and row with John Adams. Of course, they became very famous pen pals and reconnected as friends years on in life. And then they famously died on the 50th anniversary of our birth on the 4th of July. I believe it was in 1826, although I can't remember who died first. Sort of feel like Adams outlived Jefferson, but I can't remember if that's the case. Go to Jimmy Carter for a second. Longest post-presidency, as you point out. You get into great detail in the book about things that he did, why he did those things. He is ignored, if I'm going to be brutally honest, by the right. They ignore him. He's loved by the left, and there's been some revisionist biographies of him recently. I've had the chance to go to the Carter Library, and I've toured it. He did a lot of really interesting and really good things for the country, including at a time of Cold War escalation, raising the defense budget. People don't give him credit for that, but he did do that. It set up Ronald Reagan quite nicely for the 80s. But how do you think Jimmy Carter feels about his presidency? He left the presidency as a young man. It's 42 years later. Did he do more as president, or did he do more as an ex-president?
So it's interesting. When I tell people, I wrote a book called Life After Power about ex-presidents, the first thing, whether it's Democrats or Republicans, the first thing people say is, oh, you must have included Carter. It's always the one that they, Carter will be known more as a former president than as a president. Some of that is a function of how long he lived, and that most people have experienced him more as a former president than as a president. But I also think that he's really the father of the modern ex-presidency. Herbert Hoover was the first one to become an elder statesman and the first one to, kind of enter the global stage as an ex-president. But Carter was the first one to do it turn the idea of being a former president and turn it into an actual institution. And the former president is an institution. And by the way, I think this is a tremendous part of Carter's legacy because, the idea of former presidents is unique to democratic systems, at least as it pertains to them not being behind bars or under some other, ill fate. And former presidents are a feature, not a bug, of our American democratic system, even when we don't always like what they do. And Carter really leaned into that and redefined it. And so if you look at his post-presidency, nobody can accuse the guy of being anything but transparent. From the moment he left office, he sort of described it as his involuntary retirement. He was $1 million in debt because he had put his peanut farm into a blind trust. He was devastated over having lost the election. He was devastated over the hostage crisis. He was devastated over, the economy. And he was a man guided by tremendous faith. This gets back to the point about principles. And, his view was, I am guided by God to do the things that I was put on this earth to do, and I'm going to do it for as long as I can, in whatever way I can, wherever I can, and I'll be damned if my successor has a problem with it. So in that sense, him and Bush are kind of opposites of each other. But he did some amazing things. I mean, if you look at this disease called guinea worm, he basically eradicated it from Africa. If you look at what he did in Panama. When George H.W. Bush, sent him, when Noriega was trying to put his drug trafficker successor in place, he really elevated this idea of election monitoring and election transparency, which we still hold in high regard today. But he also caused all of his successors, Democrats and Republicans alike, a lot of annoyance. Right. So when George H.W. Bush is getting ready for Operation Desert Storm to get Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait, Carter's anti-war mindset kicks in and he writes, secret letters to the heads of state of, several of the permanent members of the Security Council. Who does that as an ex-president? When Bill Clinton sends him to Pyongyang in 1994 as a messenger to Kim Il-sung, he tells Carter in no uncertain terms, you're a messenger, you're not president. You're not to make any policy, you're to deliver messages. And what does Carter do? He secretly negotiates a deal without any authority, goes on CNN and announces that deal. And that's how the Clinton administration finds out about it. And so, look, I think Carter is, he's an example of a president who was both a tremendous ally to his successors and a formidable adversary to his successors. So in a lot of respects, he's not just the father of the post-presidency, but he also kind of represents the best of the post-presidency and also kind of the worst of the post-presidency and everything in between.
Yeah, listen, it's a fascinating story about him. And obviously there's a messianic feel to Carter in some ways, where he's here on a mission and he's here, generally, I think he's viewed favorably, but the right has given Carter a hard time. Obviously, current presidential candidate, former President Trump, has juxtaposed him and Joe Biden, and he's somewhat used as a rag doll by the right. And obviously, but that's the unfairness of politics. And so I've experienced that, and I appreciate it and get it. Let's go to John Quincy Adams for a second, because he was groomed to be president. He had two founders. I would think his mother, Abigail, would see herself as a founding woman of the American Republic. And so he's groomed by these two founders. He goes on to become president himself. But as you say, he does better in the House of Representatives. He's also a former Secretary of State. What a fascinating character. So why does he do better in the House of Representatives as opposed to the presidency?
So I found writing about John Quincy Adams the most inspiring part of this book. And if I'm biased, I would say that my favorite ex-president is John Quincy Adams. So, again, he has this first act that's architected for him by his parents. It's not his choice. His parents are making, their son president of the United States. And he ends up as president because of a deal struck with Henry Clay when the 1824 election goes to the House of Representatives, and it gets sort of called the corrupt bargain. And there's this moment that I write about in the book where John Quincy Adams is swimming in the Potomac, and he gets overwhelmed by the current, and his clothes get weighed down, and he nearly drowns and dies, and he has to strip down naked. And him and his valet end up riding buck naked in a horse and buggy back to the White House, and he gets there, and it's just the symbolism is just like outrageous, right? Which is, he's naked and humiliated at the precise moment where his presidency has fallen apart, and he's still got 3 more years. And so he gets defeated for re-election in 1828, which is a foregone conclusion. And all this man knows how to do is what his parents set him up for, which is to serve the Republic. And it wasn't supposed to end this way. And he obsessively writes in his diary in the most self-loathing, self-deprecating, violin playing manner. And finally, he's wandering around like a disenchanted ghost in Quincy, Massachusetts. And finally, they convince him. They say, look, you just got to go back into service. It's like the only thing that you know how to do. He's already been president. He's already been Secretary of State. He's been an ambassador multiple times. He's already served in the Senate. So the only thing left to do is go and serve in the House of Representatives. It's like the lowest position that he can possibly imagine, but he does it. And so he ends up as an ex-president, sort of a novelty in the House of Representatives, and he doesn't know what to do when he's there. And in 1830, if you were in the House of Representatives and you didn't know what to do, you just kind of read petitions. And it turned out that the petitions, some of them were from anti-slavery activists and abolitionists. And the abolitionist movement was a fringe movement there. Back then it was seen as very radical. And there was a norm that you didn't talk about slavery in Congress at the time. But Adams is reading these petitions, and he's shocked when the slaveocracy in the House lashes out at him for reading these petitions. And he's extremely principled about the right to petition. And the louder the critiques, the more voracious he is about accepting these petitions and reading them. The more he does that, obviously, the more demand there is. And he's just all of a sudden inundated with petitions from all over the country, and they decide to gag him, right? We talk about cancel culture today. In the 1830s, they tried to cancel a former president turned member of the House of Representatives. But his brain was so outsized relative to all the others in the House of Representatives that his 9 terms is just a story of him outmaneuvering and outfoxing and out-intellectualizing all of these mediocre men that he served with. And, he sort of wakes up one day as he's sort of, fighting on a daily basis to have all these petitions read. And he just wakes up one day and realizes that 2 things have happened. 1, he's become an abolitionist. 2, he's taken a movement that was fringy and radical and he's mainstreamed it. And to put this in perspective, John Quincy Adams began his career appointed by George Washington to serve in his administration. In his 9th term in the House of Representatives, he dies on the House floor serving alongside a freshman congressman named Abraham Lincoln from Illinois, this living connection between the founding generation and 2 generations later that would go on to emancipate the slaves.
Listen, I could listen to you for hours, Jared. You're a fascinating writer and a great public speaker. I've been dying to ask you this question, so I gotta see if I can frame it right. Were we right in terms of the formation of the presidency? And so I want to go back in our history. There was discussion about a potential king. Washington declined it. And we have this weird job, from a parliamentarian perspective, this executive branch is a misnomer from the way the parliamentary democracies got formed in Europe. Were we right to create a presidency? And what is the legacy of the presidency, all 46 of them?
So look, we take the evolution of Jeffersonian democracies for granted, and we often forget just how novel and revolutionary it was at the time. This idea of the peaceful transfer of power and elected by the people, albeit not all people back then. I think there's 2 things that are remarkable about the presidency. And I think about my 2 books, right? So Accidental Presidents and Life After Power. In some respects, it's a tale of 2 transitions. It's the transition, of somebody who wasn't really elected, transitioning to the presidency. And then Life After Power is the transition out of the presidency. Both of those need to be peaceful. And if I look at the founding fathers, they didn't really offer a blueprint for either. When it came to presidential succession upon a president dying in office, it was incredibly vague what happens. Lyndon Johnson in 1963 becomes president of the United States based on a precedent set by John Tyler in 1841 that's not even codified until 1967 with, the 25th Amendment, right? And so it shows you that just how revolutionary it was that the founders set in motion something that we could basically wing throughout the course of our history and muddle through and not get it perfectly, but more or less get it right. And if you think about former presidents, they didn't have a 2-term limit. That too gets codified in that same amendment in an earlier amendment, the 22nd Amendment after FDR's presidency. And so they left no provision for what to do with ex-presidents. Washington, sort of annotates it with, the precedent of 2 terms. But as we've seen throughout history, many presidents have chanced that. Ulysses Grant tried to come back for a non-consecutive 3rd term. FDR was elected 4 times. And so, it wasn't a foregone conclusion that, you wouldn't have presidents stay forever. And so if I reflect back on the magic of our American democracy and what's so extraordinary about the idea of the American Revolution, they got so much right. I mean, they got a lot wrong also, but what they put in place in those early days before Washington becomes president, the fact that that was enough of a guide that could be iterated on over the course of history, and despite all the problems in the Republic that people get up in arms about tonight, I think that at this moment in time, I think you have to reflect back on the last 200 plus years, and we've done pretty good, given how many bumps in the road there were.
System's fragile. I think that's the other thing. The system was made by men mostly. We could say men and women, but it was made mostly by men. It was a fragile system. And it took noble ideas, and it took noble decision making, and it took a great deal of humility to bow out appropriately to allow for this succession, which has created this flat structure, has allowed the Cohen family and the Scaramucci family to flourish in a country like this, because you don't have that aristocracy and you don't have that royalty, the monarchical stuff that holds back some of these other countries. I want to flip over. I know we're running out of time, but if I can just get you a few more moments, I want to flip over to Accidental Presidents, 8 Men Who Changed America, which was another incredible book. And I want to talk about Harry Truman for a second. What an unexpected presidency, right? He's a failed haberdasher. He's part of this Pendergast political machine in Missouri. He gets to the Senate. He doesn't see himself anywhere close to the presidency. He wants to nominate Burns to be the vice president in 44. He walks into the meeting. He hears FDR's voice, and wait a minute, they want me. And so he reluctantly accepts it. And then, of course, he's told by Eleanor Roosevelt, he says, "How can I help you?" upon the death of her husband. And, of course, Eleanor says, the real question is, how can we help you? And so there he is. He's got to make some fateful decisions. Tell us a little bit about him.
So Harry Truman is basically a provincial politician from Missouri who really only ends up thrown on the ticket in 1944 because the Democratic Party bosses know that FDR is a dying man, but nobody dares admit it. And FDR also knew that he was on borrowed time, and he didn't want to give the party bosses any sense that they owned his presidency. So he played lots of manipulative games to kind of drag it out. And, Truman, again, at the 11th hour, ends up on the ticket because the Democratic Party bosses just cannot fathom the idea of Henry Wallace becoming president of the United States if FDR dies, because they either thought he was too liberal even for them, or they thought he was a communist sympathizer. And I think it's remarkable because despite how sick FDR was, there seems to have been very little contemplation about the idea of a Harry Truman presidency. So in Truman's 82 days in office as vice president, he only meets FDR 2 times. He never steps foot in the map room where World War II is being planned. He doesn't get a single intelligence briefing. He doesn't meet a single world leader. He's not briefed on the atomic bomb and the Manhattan Project. He's basically out kind of socializing as vice president, which is kind of what you do. And when FDR dies on April 12th, 1945, I don't believe that there is a man in history that has inherited a greater inflection point than Harry Truman at that particular moment in time. You had the Battle of Okinawa raging, one of the fiercest battles. You had the prospect of having to move 1 million men from the European theater to the Asian Pacific theater. You had Stalin reneging on all of his promises from Yalta. You had a turf battle between the Army and Navy. You had Churchill playing all kinds of games. The list goes on. And Harry Truman has to spend his first couple days as president just learning where these countries are on a map, in the map room. And, I always say about Truman that he was set up for just utter failure. And the fact that he managed to end the war in 9 months, make some of the toughest decisions, reshape the World War II era and reshaped the international system. I don't know that it's statistically improbable as much as it shows you that leaders aren't leaders until the context gives them the opportunity to step up. And by the way, we've seen this today with, President Zelensky, very different as a wartime president. And so until they're tested, leaders aren't, you can't really know that leaders are made. Sometimes leaders, in the context of a campaign, somebody who seems like a great leader, they fumble it when there's a real test. And, Harry Truman is an example of a leader made by and for a crisis.
I find your writing fascinating because you're bringing things that we learned about in social studies in a very two-dimensional way about these figures, and you're adding color, you're adding technicolor, and you're adding a perspective of their personalities and their humanness. Sometimes we look at our founders and we put them in effigy, but at the end of the day, with all the frailty and all of the shortcomings of a human being, they carried all of that with them as well. And I just find it fascinating that you capture that so well. We're at the point in the podcast where me and my producers, we come up with 5 words for the author. And so that you got to react to the words, okay? So I'll say them and you give me a reaction. So the first word I'm thinking of, Jared, is power.
Dangerous, yet burden of responsibility.
It's interesting you say dangerous because the founders would have said dangerous. The Federalist Papers said we're just not equipped for it, which is why the separation of powers, those clauses in the contract known as the Constitution, are the most important. Justice Scalia once said to me at lunch with him, I said, what's the most important part of the Constitution? He said, separation of powers. Without that, we don't have this liberty. Service. What about the word service, sir?
The most important thing that one can do when put on this earth, whether they do it early in life or later in life.
Oh, well said. I think Jackie Robinson once said that we're at our best when we're serving others. Chaos.
A reality. Something that can't just be managed. Something that requires solution.
I'm going to say America. Some people say Murica, and you know what I mean when I say Murica? The word America.
Don't give up on her.
Yeah, amen. It's a beautiful place. It's been an incredible global experiment. The word president, Jared.
Steward of the Republic.
Yeah, and as you pointed out in your book, it's the only job where every American citizen that's eligible to vote votes for that job. The other jobs in the Republic are limited to your location, if it's a congressional district, or your state. But this federal job is one that we all get the chance to vote for. And so it's a very powerful position and one that requires a lot of responsibility. What's next for you?
It's interesting. I used to be one of these. So when you spend, 3 or 4 years writing a book, you sort of, 2 things happen. 1, you get obsessed with the topic. 2, you find ways to relate what you're writing to like literally anything anyone says. So somebody tells me the sky is blue, I say we should talk about John Quincy Adams or William Howard Taft. But it's been a really interesting, reflective journey for me to be 42 years old. I started this book in my 30s, writing about retirement. It morphed. I thought I was writing about the last chapter of life. What I realized is I was writing about a recurring question we're going to ask many times in life, which is, what do we do next? And I used to be one of these people who, I would say that I kind of, live to work, meaning I'd get up every single day and I would think about work, think about what I was going to do next for work. And I wasn't living in the present. And I think this book helped me get to a mental state. And I also transitioned jobs from Google to Goldman Sachs while writing this book, where I finally find myself in a situation where I think I'm somebody who works to live. And what I mean by that is when people ask me what's next, my answer is, on this particular day, I engaged with the smartest people, worked on the most interesting ideas, got to feel like I was having an impact. And what's next is I want to wake up tomorrow and do it all over again. And I don't want to think about what's next.
Well, I think it's brilliant. And by the way, you do work at a very special place. I spent 7 years of my life there. Of course, it was 27 years ago, so it's a little different place than the one that I left in 1996. But it is unique and top of the field for anybody. And I always remind my friends and colleagues that are there or have left there how lucky we all are to have had that shared experience at Goldman. But you got a lot of things coming, and so I want to be one of those guys that watches and cheers you on. I'm looking forward to your next books, but the title of this book is Life After Power: 7 Presidents and Their Search for Purpose Beyond the White House. A best-selling New York Times best-selling author, Jared Cohen. With great respect, sir, thank you for joining us on Open Book. We love your work.
Anthony, thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed it.
He is, without much debate, one of the greatest political athletes of all time. He was able to convince a wide swath of the American public, including some people who might have formerly voted Democrat, that he would be a vessel for their frustrations, that when people came after him, they were going after them. People identified with him. They identified with him in a way that they don't typically identify with politicians.
Welcome to Open Book. I am your host, Anthony Scaramucci. Joining us is Alex Eisenstadt. Now, Alex and I go back a long ways. Okay, I don't know if you remember this, but we go back to the Mitt Romney campaign, which is the 2012 campaign. So that's 2011, my friend. So 14 years. He is a senior political writer at Axios. He's a best-selling author. And the title of the book is Revenge: The Inside Story of Trump's Return to Power. It's great to have you on. But before we get into the book, tell us a little bit about Alex Eisenstadt. What are you? Who are you? Where'd you come from? Where were you raised? Give me some good bio gossipy stuff about Alex.
Sure. Well, first of all, thanks for having me, Anthony, and congratulations on all your success with the podcast and everything else you do. I grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area. Went to a small school in the mainline suburbs of Philadelphia. Joined Politico in late 2008, and I was there for 16 years, covered all kinds of political things, started covering Trump in 2015, and did it all the way through nonstop ever since. Joined Axios in late January of this year, so I'm new there, and I started working on this book in February of 2023, right after Trump kicked off his comeback campaign. And I spent 2 years writing it, and it came out on Tuesday of this week, Tuesday the 18th.
All right, it's incredibly well sourced. Okay, it's because when I read the book, I'm like, okay, he definitely said that, and I read Trump definitely said that because what Trump does is he repeats himself a lot, and so he is saying shit today that he said in 2015 and 2016. As I was on a plane, so I know he said the stuff, and so. You don't have to give me your sources, of course. I would never ask you that, but tell us a little bit about your sourcing. People come to you, right? They tell you,
yeah.
It's almost like they want journalists like you to know the hysteria and the mania that's going on. So why is that? Without, of course, giving up any names.
Yeah.
Tell me why that is.
No, so this is an important question, and I'm glad you're asking it. So when I started writing this book, what I found was that I went to a bunch of people who are in Trump world and close to him, people who are very much involved in the campaign, members of Congress, donors, advisors, allies, the like. I went to a wide spectrum of people, and I told them I was writing this book. I wanted to embark on this project of covering this campaign, and I wanted them to essentially use me as their journal, where I would talk to them daily, where they would tell me what was going on, their impressions, what they saw day to day. And what I found was that people were very willing to talk. They were very open about talking. And I think everyone knew that this was going to be an interesting race. I don't think anyone knew exactly what the twists and turns would be, but I think everyone knew it was going to be very dramatic. And what I found was that people wanted to tell their story about what happened. And I think people knew that history would be made, and they saw this as something that they wanted to be involved in, and they wanted to participate in, helping out a journalistic project. And I told them, look, I'm trying to be fair. I'm not trying to write a pro-Trump book or an anti-Trump book. I'm just trying to tell the story behind the scenes of what happened and let readers feel like they're a fly on the wall and they're there in the room as these historical events are happening.
Well, okay. Well, you did an amazing job of that, but I had a couple of reactions to this book. So,
Sure.
One of the reactions is that the conventional wisdom is often, if not always, but often wrong about Trump. I would say 90% of the time it's wrong. So J621, Trump is dead. McCarthy thought that. McConnell thought that. Pundits thought that. Okay, he's done. He's a insurrectionist traitor to the United States. Trump doesn't think he's done. Trump's raising hundreds of millions of dollars off of the quote unquote election lie. So tell us about the mindset of the people around Donald Trump. Did they think he was dead in 2021? I mean, again, politically dead, because I want to be very specific here. God forbid. And then the question is, how did his resurrection evolve? Tell us about his confidence level over the last couple of years. Where was it at different points?
I think that one cannot overstate the degree to which Trump was left for dead after January 6th, and including some people who are very close to him. So let's go back to January of 2021. Trump comes back to Mar-a-Lago. He has no political operation to speak of. He is suspicious of the people who work for him. He suspects that they stole money from him. Now, to be clear, Trump is always suspecting that people are stealing money from him and taking advantage of him. But he decides to get rid of his political operation, or at least what is left of it. You go back to this time, and a lot of his old New York friends, the people who came up with him in business, they've decided to leave him. He isn't getting his calls returned anymore. People don't want to have it. He's disregarded in a lot of respects until he calls up Susie Wiles and says, I want you to figure out what's going on in my political operation. I want you to help me. And they didn't even have at Mar-a-Lago at that time. Trump didn't even have his private Wi-Fi at that point. He had nothing. So Susie Wiles drives to and from her home in Jacksonville to brief Trump. And she builds a political operation from scratch, in part because he didn't have anything, in part because a lot of people who worked for him left him for dead. And then in terms of his overall mindset, Trump has very much sharply divided the American public. There are people who love him and there are people who hate him. I don't think there's a whole lot in between there. And what one can conclude from this race, and this is one of the overall conclusions from this book, is that he is, without much debate, one of the greatest political athletes of all time. He was able to convince a wide swath of the American public, including some people who might have formerly voted Democrat, that he would be a vessel for their frustrations, that when people came after him, they were going after them. And people identified with him, and they identified with him in a way that they don't typically identify with politicians. One important point to make after January 6th is he, thanks to his marketing power, was able to almost turn that into a plus for himself, in that he was able to convince people that it was simply the result of the Justice Department coming after him. And if you look at that, he's still pushing that message. When he goes to the DOJ and he launches this purge of the DOJ and the FBI, getting rid of anyone who was involved in any tangential way to the investigation related to January 6th. He has completely rewritten the narrative to cast himself as a victim. And to some extent, it's worked.
So when do things start to get better for him? He's on trial, and they're going to convict him of being a felon. He's got 34 felony counts. Is that a low for him? Is that weirdly contrarian, galvanizing support for him? Tell us when things really started to seismically change.
Yeah.
Wait a minute, this guy's mounting a very big political comeback.
So here's a really important point in the book. Let's go back to very, very early 2023, right? In late 2022, the Republican Party has a very disappointing midterm election. Trump gets a lot of blame for that, right? Because of the candidates that he endorsed, many of whom went on to lose in the general election, right? A couple weeks after that, you have this famous or infamous dinner that Trump has with the rapper Ye and Nick Fuentes, both of whom are avowed anti-Semites, right? In Fuentes' case, a Holocaust denier. You have a couple weeks after that, Trump puts out a Truth Social, essentially calling for the abolishment of the Constitution. You have a couple weeks after that, Trump decides to put out NFT baseball cards of himself, right? And even within Trump's inner circle at that point, there was a widespread belief that Trump might be heading off the rails, that he questions about how serious he really was about this comeback campaign, and that maybe it's over before it started. You go back you then fast forward a few weeks later, and there is a train derailment in Ohio, and Trump decides to go down there. He goes down there with J.D. Vance, who helps to organize that trip. He goes to a McDonald's, does some photo ops, and all of a sudden you have the narrative set for this campaign. You talk to everyone and they'll tell you that visit to East Palestine, Ohio was a turning point in this campaign because it gave Trump the message that he was looking for, which is that he could identify with blue collar people who feel like the federal government hasn't done enough for them. And if you look at what those people were saying on that trip, they were telling him that the federal government and the Biden administration wasn't doing enough to help them following this train derailment. And if you look at that visit, his visit to McDonald's, that was something, those retail stops, that person-to-person retail, that he really hadn't done at all before in his political career, right? Like, this guy is a germaphobe. And the fact that he would show up at McDonald's, that he would talk to potential supporters, that became something he did throughout the campaign up until the very end, where he literally did a photo op where he literally was working at a McDonald's. So that East Palestine visit was a huge turning point for him.
Yeah, I guess, and that probably also was a precursor to Vance becoming the vice president and so forth. But
Sure.
I guess where I'm trying to be as objective as possible, because I've had my ups and downs with Donald Trump, and obviously I think he's a danger to our society. I've been pretty open to that, but there's something going on in the society right now, and I'm going to say it. I want you to react to it. I
Sure.
think he's the greatest culture warrior of our time. I think there is a culture war going on in the country: pronoun usage, woke, DEI. The buckle of the Bible Belt doesn't like non-traditional America in their minds. And I think Donald Trump has assaulted the people. He's triggered the liberals, and he's got them with their hair on fire on most cable channels.
Yep.
And the right is dominating the media now. Take a look. They say the left is the left-wing media, the left is dominating, but the right really has a stronghold on ratings, whether it's Joe Rogan, radio, podcasting, Fox News. And so respond to that. Is he a formidable culture warrior? And is culture going to be a 26 issue for the midterms and another 28 issue? And what does that say about the Democrats? What are they missing here? First of all, am I right? Yes or no? And
on the culture war thing,
what does it say about the Democrats?
Oh, I think without question, you're right about the culture war. He has found cultural issues that deeply split the American society, and that in many cases are winning political issues, right? They made the Trump campaign took the trans issue and made it a centerpiece of their effort. Go back and look at the ads they ran on transgender issues. You talk to people who are involved in the Trump campaign, and they will tell you that was a turning point, that running trans ads helped them, not just with their base, though certainly it did, but it helped them peel off Black voters, other minority voters, suburban women in some cases, people who traditionally vote Democratic. And so, yes, I think Trump is absolutely a culture warrior. I don't see that stopping. I think that he has found ways to trigger the left, take positions that are not necessarily palatable to the American public from an electoral perspective. And I think he has united conservatives and his supporters behind him, and in some cases, people who weren't necessarily traditional Republican voters. And forgive me, what was the next question? I'm sorry.
Yeah, no. But the Democrats, I don't think understand this. I think they've decided they've taken his bait. They've enraged themselves. They've started an internecine fight with each other, and they want to double and triple down on nonsense as opposed to get back to white middle class and lower middle income voters, which was their bread and butter for a century.
Yeah, I think that is something the Democratic Party is very much struggling with right now. And it's hard for them when they don't even have a leader of their party who's determining what their message is. And I'll just say a couple of things about the podcast issue, because it seems to me like podcasts and YouTube and streaming is very much becoming the dominant way of communicating with people. And you know this as a guy who has, you have a couple of very popular podcasts right now. I've seen you on the Spotify top charts. And so the power of communicating with people through podcasts, through non-traditional ways, in addition to the work that you do on more traditional cable news. And so, you've experienced this personally, I think. But if you look at the top Spotify charts, it's almost entirely dominated by conservatives at this point.
Wow. Listen, I agree. I mean, I think that that's the weird thing about it. Trump tells you that the left-wing media is controlling things. The other great irony is on migration. If people come across the border, Elon Musk and Donald Trump say, well, they're going to turn the nation blue, but actually those people are traditional Catholics generally,
right?
And they slant towards conservatism. So there's a big irony there. What would turn the country blue, Alex Eisenstadt? Having Canada be the 51st state. That would turn the country blue. I mean, they're all liberals up there. I know what Trump's doing,
Yeah. Here's the interesting thing, though, about the podcast issue, which is that, it's not just the Charlie Kirks of the world who are out there who are sort of traditionally aligned with, they're sort of the classic MAGA supporter, right? You also, if you look at the top of the charts, it's also people like Rogan. And those are people who probably are skewing more pro-Trump at this point, but they are appealing to a less traditional MAGA voter. So a lot of men who feel like they are disregarded by society, who are struggling economically, who are maybe struggling emotionally in some cases. And those people have really come to identify with Trump. And Trump did very well among male voters, including male voters who might not typically vote in elections. I mean, look at where Trump spent time. It wasn't just on Rogan. It was on places like Theo Vaughn, another very popular podcaster. He was hanging out. Trump was literally hanging out at frat houses.
He did well on those podcasts. He did well on Theo Vaughn's podcast. My kids objectively give him a high grade on that. I guess before I let you go, I want to talk about the shadow effort, which you write about in the book. The GOP is trying to stop Trump. What's the most surprising thing that you learned there? And what do you think of the party formerly known as the GOP? The party's now the MAGA Republicans. It's Trump decapitated that party, hostile takeover. He owns the party that is now named the Republicans, but it's really the Trumplicans. Talk about the old party of McCain and Romney and Bush and their attempt to try to stop him. And tell me a little bit about them and tell me a little bit about where you think they're going.
You look at what happened in this past election in terms of their efforts to stop Trump, and it felt very much like their efforts in 2015, 2016. And you'll remember that you had donors like Paul Singer and other actually people aligned with the old Romney machine and Mitt Romney himself, who during the 2015, early 2016 part of the Republican Party primary spent millions of dollars in this last-ditch effort to stop Trump from winning the nomination. And it completely failed. It blew up. And it felt like a lot of the same stuff happened in 2023, right? Where Ron DeSantis has this successful 2022 midterm win. And all of a sudden, he is seen as the vessel of the Republican establishment. He's the guy who can finally take out Donald Trump. And so Fox News gets behind DeSantis. The Murdoch machine gets behind DeSantis. And this is actually a theme in the book, which is that for all people talk about Fox News loving Donald Trump, it's actually a marriage of convenience. That Murdoch and a lot of the people associated with Fox actually never really liked Trump that much. They saw him as a means of making money and as being good for business. But anyways, they got behind DeSantis. You had other major Republican donors getting behind DeSantis. George W. Bush, of course, no big Trump fan. After DeSantis wins re-election, ends up calling up DeSantis to congratulate him. You had this Republican establishment that was firmly behind Ron DeSantis. And then immediately as DeSantis pokes his head out, begins to engage nationally, things don't turn out well for him. It immediately becomes apparent that he's not ready for the national stage and he's not ready for prime time. Trump at this point is becoming ascendant. He is regaining traction. And once again, this effort to stop Trump just folds. It just kind of collapses upon itself, right? Trump ends up racking up endorsements. DeSantis starts to fade, and it's over.
Yeah, it is objectively the greatest political comeback, I think, in the modern era, if not U.S. history. So we have 5 words that we picked out of your book, and I want you to respond to these, and you can give me a sentence or two, sort of a Ross shot test at the end of our podcast. I say the word Republican. You say what?
It's a party that is now dominated by Donald Trump.
Yes, it's a populist party now. This is a different party than the one that we grew up with. Okay. I say the word Democrat. You say what?
It's a party that is in opposition to Donald Trump, but is very much struggling to find its way right now.
Yeah. Yeah. Or, I'm paraphrasing. I think Will Rogers once said, I belong to 6 disorganized parties. I'm a Democrat or something like that, right? Okay. So revenge. Title of your book. Say the word revenge. You think of what?
Trump's motivation above all else to get back at the people who he believes are stopping him or have tried to stop him or who were in his way at any time.
Yeah. Also, he needed to avoid jail. He had a pretty big indictment coming on the January 6th stuff. It's interesting. Merrick Garland didn't go after him. It's interesting. But anyway, all right. 2029, 100 years after the stock market crashed, is Donald Trump going to be president on January 20th, 2029?
I don't believe he will be. I think he loves, and we go back to this. This is part of our conversation earlier. He sees it as a means of triggering the left. And when he talks about running for president again in 2028, he sees that as a way of triggering the left and getting the left to talk about things that are not electorally, that are focusing on issues that do not help them electorally. So when he talks about that, he knows it triggers them.
He declares martial law at some point and cancels the election? He Viktor Orbán's the U.S.?
Look, I mean, it's hard for me to predict that. I'll leave that to others to predict.
I'm just throwing it out there so it doesn't. The more you talk about it potentially happening, it'll maybe gird people to make sure it doesn't.
Right.
All right. So 2029, we have a different president.
Okay.
Is that you say that it's January 20th?
I mean, that would be my assumption.
That would be your guess. Okay, I'm going to go with that as well. Okay, I say the word Trump. I say the word Trump.
Sure.
You say what?
Someone who still has widespread power, widespread influence. Consider this for a second. You're someone who's been involved in fundraising for the Republican Party. You've raised a ton of money over the years, right?
30 years. Been involved for 30 years. Yep.
Right. So Trump has in his political operation right now $500 million. We and others have now reported that Elon Musk is prepared to donate another $100 million. In other words, let's just say for the sake of this conversation, Trump has $600 million in his war chest. That is an astonishing amount of money. That is more money potentially than the rest of the Republican Party will raise over the course of this cycle, potentially.
Yeah,
he is going to be able to shape the midterms for years to come. He's going to be able to shape the midterms, and he's potentially going to be able to shape politics for years to come. Not just because of his stature, but because of the money he has.
No question. You are 100% right. Well, my last question, then I'm going to let you go. Is he going to change the name of Washington, D.C. to Trump, D.C.?
here would be my prediction.
He's
I
as
think.
good of a president as George Washington. He told us that in the State of the Union. So is he going to do that?
Okay, so here I'm going to give you a prediction. Okay, I think he might float it at one point to once again trigger the left. I don't think he'll actually do it.
Okay, you don't think he's going to be able to do it. All right, but he. Let me say. I think you and I. Well, I think you and I are unanimously. You and I would say he would want to do that. If I said to him tonight, I say, Mr. President, we're going to change Washington, D.C. to Trump, D.C. And all we got to do is press a button and everything will change. He would do that, or he'd say, no, I'm a traditionalist. Let's leave it in George Washington's name. What would he say?
I think the former, and he would float it out potentially on Truth Social to make people on the left to make their heads explode. Okay. Would he actually do it? I'm skeptical.
He would do it. He would do it if he could do it. Come on, Alex. You've been around this thing a long time.
He would do it if he could do it. I agree.
He would do it if he could do it.
He would do it if he could do it.
The title of the book is Revenge, the Inside Story of Trump's Return to Power. It's an amazing book. It's incredibly well-researched, well-sourced. And if you really want to know what happened over the last 18 months in Trump world, read Alex Eisenstadt's book, Revenge. Thank you so much.